use the camera over here.
So in the beginning, so I'll give a few words in the beginning. Thank you everyone for joining us on the 2023 version on the Constance Van Eeden Student Seminar of the Department of Stats. Sorry for the hustle, but I think we have to resort to this monitor. It is a great pleasure for us to have Dr. Kevin Murphy from Google as a speaker this year. And this seminar is made possible by Canadian Statistical Science Institute and the Constance Van Eeden Fund. So to acknowledge the legacy of Dr. Van Eeden, Professor Nancy Heckman will share a few words in memory of this important figure in our.
So great to have you here, Kevin. And you'll get your whole, I'm sure you'll get a big introduction, and as is your due. But right now, I'll say a few words about Constance Van Eeden. She was an amazing statistician, a true pioneer, and an incredible woman. She made contributions to the theory of restricted parameter estimation, beginning with her PhD thesis defended in 1958 in the Netherlands. Her work in this area has conceptual and theoretical interest, and with the advent of computers, it has practical interest now that it can be applied, things can be calculated. So think of, for instance, isotonic regression, which is a restricted parameter problem. She also made many contributions to non-parametric statistics, rank-based statistics, those classical methods. And she also dabbled a little bit in how we think of non-parametric statistics today. She did some kernel-based smoothing and density estimation in the 1980s. She had a long collaboration with our very own Jim Zidek in statistical decision theory. For her research, she was honored by the Statistical Society of Canada, receiving the gold medal in 1990. Most of her academic career was at the Université de Montréal, where her impact on statistics training in the Francophone community is widely evident, especially if you look at all the PhD students that she trained. On her definite air quotes retirement to her home in the Netherlands, she began a lovely habit of being part of this community, visiting UBC for 4 months in the fall for every year. And she had an honorary position, honorary professor of statistics. She continued with her research, interacted with students. A lot of the research was with Jim Zidek. These visits occurred from the late 1980s until 2012. When travel became just became too difficult for her. Some of us here knew Constance. Others of you did not have the chance to enjoy her company, her sharp wit, her even sharper intellect, her passion for statistics, and her famous mathematical rigor. She took great joy in finding, serious mistakes in published papers. And she also seemed to enjoy assigning those papers to 548 students in our PhD in comprehensive qualifying course. I will always remember that little Dutch twinkle in her eye also. I think other people do, and she'd get that little smile, mischievous smile. She was just a joy. We are indeed blessed to have had her as a part of our community. And we are doubly blessed by her enormous generosity in establishing the Constance Van Eeden Fund in 1998. So she lived to enjoy a lot of what came out of that fund. The fund supports student awards, and it supports research visitors to our department, such as Kevin. Constance passed away in 2021 after a very, very rich and valuable life. But her spirit truly lives on in our hearts, in our minds, and through these kinds of talks. So we thank you, Constance. We also thank the graduate students who have organized this talk. It would please Constance immensely. She so loved interacting with students. And we especially thank you, Kevin, for visiting us. It's so good to see you.
Great, thank you.
Thank you, Nancy, for these kind words. Moving on to the seminar now, it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Kevin Murphy to our first speaker. So Dr. Murphy is a research scientist in Google, California. He's leading a team in Google Brain, focusing on generative modeling, Bayesian inference, machine learning, and various other topics. So before joining Google, he was an associate professor at the Department of Statistics and Computer Science at UBC. And Dr. Murphy has made a significant contribution to the field through his list of publications in conferences and journals, as well as 3 amazing textbooks on probabilistic machine learning. So his famous book, Machine Learning, a Probabilistic Perspective, has influenced many practitioners and researchers in this area, including myself. So today, Dr. Murphy will present a unified perspective on the field of machine learning research, following the structure of his new book, Probabilistic Machine Learning Advanced Topics, which I believe will be out soon, right? Yeah. So also we asked this audience on Zoom that if any questions during the presentation, please leave them in the Q&A box. We will have the Q&A session afterwards. So Dr. Murphy, please take it away.
Great. Thank you very much for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here. I haven't been back to the stats department in a long time, although I've been up to Vancouver now and then. And it's great to see so many people here. Sorry for the delays in getting started. So I wanted to give sort of a big picture talk about machine learning. And the title I picked was The 4 Pillars of Machine Learning. And I want to start by acknowledging that, in fact, this title has already been taken. I didn't realize this until after I was making my slides. So Jeff Clune is a professor in the CS department here, and he recently gave a talk about AI, and he calls them the 4 pillars of AI. So I guess it's just a meme or in the zeitgeist or something. His pillars are very different than mine. Also interesting, but actually surprisingly less related than you might think. So I could have used the term AI, and that's sort of what you hear in the media, but I'd actually think machine learning is probably a more accurate description for the technology that's powering some of these things that you I'm sure have come across, right? So this is a self-driving car from Waymo. This is I'm not actually sure this is an autonomous robot, but I think it's from Honda, I guess. OpenAI has made it ChatGPT and many other things. Okay, who has not heard of ChatGPT? I heard there's one of your politicians is trying to ban ChatGPT. I learned this from this seminar series on AI. I've forgotten her name. Rembler, maybe, and she wanted to pass legislation because there are some issues. We'll talk maybe a little bit about some of those issues, or perhaps during the Q&A. But you know, this technology is being used for all kinds of things, medical examinations and protein prediction and so on. So tons of applications, lots of impact. It can be a little, if you're an outsider, it can be hard to sort of understand the big picture, right, and how these things interrelate, because the amount of applications is exploding, the amount of research papers is just exploding at a crazy rate, and it's really hard to see the wood for the trees. So I've written 3 books, as was mentioned, that try to sort of summarize, obviously not the whole field, but you know, a good chunk. This is the book I wrote when I was mostly at UBC 2012. This actually won the group prize. And then a few years ago, I thought, well, I better update it because the field has changed so much. And my original plan was just like add some deep learning and add some new advancements in the field. And the book was getting like ridiculously big, and the publisher said, no, you need to split it into 2. So I ended up having 2 volumes. So volume 1's already out. If anyone has a copy, I'm happy to sign it. You can get it for free online. You can buy it. Volume 2 is also online already, and it'll be in print in August. And so volume 2 is sort of is my favorite one because it's sort of it has a nice sort of architecture for the whole field. And there are actually 6 sections, but I'm just going to cover 4 of them. And these are the 4 pillars. And I think of these as like the 4 main categories of tasks that people with machine learning are interested in tackling. So what I plan to do is sort of go over these and just sort of explain what I mean by this slice of the field, and then give a few examples of some work that I've done in these areas. And these are just going to be vignettes. Like I don't have time to go into detail. I actually thought I only had an hour, but nevertheless, but we've just burned 20 minutes. So in fact, I really only do have an hour. So ask me questions at the end if you want more details, and the papers are all online. Okay, so prediction, it's like happens to be part 3 of my book. What do I mean by that? Well, let's start at the basics, right? Linear regression is a prediction problem, right? Everyone in this room knows what this is. I just put this slide up to just sort of ground notation. We'll see a lot of, actually there are very few equations in this talk, but this is the sort of notation I'm using. So I want to predict an output given an input, right? And in this case, they're both 1D scalars, but we can generalize that. We can have categorical outputs and other kinds of distributions on the output side, and that gets you GLMs. And then we can make these things nonlinear, and that's basically what a neural network is. At least a traditional feed-forward kind of neural network. It's just like a nonlinear regression of GLM. And I don't know, hopefully you've all seen these kinds of figures, but they're basically differentiable circuits with a lot of parameters in them. In this case, there are not a lot of parameters, but you can make these models very, very deep. And that's where exciting things start to happen. But you could look at all of this and say, well, so there are a lot of parameters in these models, and the parameters correspond to the weights in these layers. So you have to estimate these from data. And so, AI people say, oh, it's like learning, it's like the brain. It's really just maximum likeliness estimation. Okay, that's actually exactly what it is. That actually is basically the only thing that ChatGPT is doing when it's trained is MLE, but it's just done at scale, right, on a ridiculous amount of data. And so to handle the volume of data, you have to use stochastic approximations. And then the technique is just SGD. So the technology is actually really quite simple. It's just when you scale it up, it does kind of amazing things. And not all of the technology. There are fancier methods, and we'll see some of them, but they're sort of more interesting from a methods point of view, but they're not always necessarily better. If you have enough data, then these simple things work well. That's called the bitter lesson of AI. That's a phrase from Richard Sun, who's a professor in Alberta. So you could step back and say, well, this is just like glorified curve fitting. So this is a quote from Uday Pearl, who's a professor at UCLA, very famous for his work in causality and other work he did. Also worked in Bayesian networks and also worked in AI heuristic search. He has 3 landmark books, but it's causality that rightfully won him I think he got the Turing Award for that. So he has a beef with all of this deep learning stuff, and he says it's just function fitting, and that's not going to help you discover the true causal nature of the world. But I think when you hear the phrase curve fitting, I mean, technically that's true, but it's a bit misleading, I would say, because maybe the mental image you have is this sort of 1D map, and that doesn't seem very interesting, right? I mean, people were doing this with splines and whatnot in the 50s. But once you move to high dimensions, things really change. So here's an example of some project I did a few years ago. So the input's some high dimensional input. So it's an image, and the output's also somewhat high dimensional. It's like all the locations of all the people and all of their body joints, right? So this is an input-output mapping. We call this pose recognition. I did a lot of work in computer vision over the years at Google. And this huge industry is built around this kind of technology. That's just function fitting. It's just curve fitting, but they're high-dimensional curves. So I think calling it just curve fitting is a little bit of an underselling. You can also, so here, there's maybe not much ambiguity, but in many interesting problems, there's ambiguity about what the right output should be. So we had this project on trajectory forecasting, and I think the method was based on some kind of variational graph recurrent neural net, some hybrid thing. And you observe trajectories of some basketball players, and then you want to predict where they're going to move next. And so you get a distribution of the future outcomes. So that's one of the reasons I sort of focus on probabilistic models, because in general, you don't know what the future will be. So these are also, curve fitting problems in some senses. And, it works really well. And you can just scale this up, and you can apply it to all kinds of things. And you'll come across headlines like this. I'm sure you've seen headlines like this, right? Oh, these machines are better than doctors, and they're going to replace us all. And in certain regimes, they are better than humans, right? There's no denying that. However, there are also headlines like this, which, oh, you can't see it. Are you serious? Oh, it's just a lag. Zoom is I guess I should watch that to make sure you see what I see. So I think this is actually from a campaign. There's a privately funded campaign called the Dawn Project, where they're very much against self-driving cars for some reason. But they did this test, and they apparently showed that the Tesla detection systems were unable to detect, in this case, mannequin figures of child size for extra clickbait factor. But the point is this technology is getting deployed in pretty high stakes settings, and it doesn't always work. And why is that, right? It feels like, we get amazing, we have speech recognition, we have machine translation. It seems to be working in many cases very, very well. And then you get these sort of edge cases where it fails. And there are even simpler, so it's interesting to study that now as a sort of a methods problem. So you can make sort of fruit fly versions of these problems to try to understand what's going on. So this is paper from some folks listed at the bottom, where they were looking at like animal classification, so a very simplified problem. And they found that, relatively reasonable networks, convolutional networks, would make pretty embarrassingly bad mistakes, like classifying this thing as a cow. Okay, and this is maybe with the latest models it wouldn't do that, but a few years ago they were still making mistakes like this, and you can still always find edge cases. So why is that? Well, it's to do with the data. So in the training data, most of the cows were on a grassy background, and the camels were on a sandy background. So the model was recognizing the category camel based on the background color, or the category cow based on the background color. It was essentially ignoring the animal in the front, because so this is a sort of an accidental spurious correlation in the data that people weren't aware of at the time. And the network will pick whatever signal is reliable in the training set. And it's easier to detect backgrounds than it is to detect the shapes of these objects, because the shapes change and the backgrounds are constant. So this is called a shortcut. And models, these deep networks are great at finding shortcuts. It's not just deep models. I mean, linear models also have this topology, right? It's a property of the data and the fact that the model doesn't capture everything. So, I mean, this is a toy problem, right? But it's sort of meant to get the point across. But it arises in the real world as well. So this is a real example in a chest X-ray system that's designed to classify certain kinds of diseases. And there are various confounding factors that are not really related to the disease or not reliably and might change, but are picked up by the system rather than the disease itself. So if you look at these images, this is from the Chexpert data set. So this is a female and this is a male. These are frontal chest X-rays. So it's much easier to diagnose sex than it is to diagnose the disease. So if the sex is correlated with the disease in the training data, the model will just learn to be basically a gender classifier or a sex classifier. And that isn't a reliable signal if the ratio changes in the downstream distribution. So this is Zubin Garamati, who's the head of Google Brain. He calls this the big lie of machine learning, which is that the data that you see, that you train your model on, it doesn't really matter what kind of model it is, big or small. The main assumption is that the distribution of the data that you'll see in the real world at test time is the same as what you trained on, and that's not true in general. And this problem is called distribution shift. And if the target distribution, so we'll start introducing some notation here. So the target distribution P sub T is the data that you see at test time, that you see in the wild. And that might be different than the source distribution P sub S, which is the one that you collected your training data from. And if these distributions differ, then all bets are off in terms of the expected loss that you might incur, right? Arbitrarily bad things can happen, depending on how big the shift is. And depending, of course, on whether your loss function is sensitive to those shifts. So this is a big challenge. So we have predictive models that are very accurate, but they can sort of fail catastrophically when the world changes. So one approach that you can take to tackle this is distributionally robust optimization. So you say, I want to find a model that minimizes my expected loss, but I'm going to maximize over the set of target distributions that I might see. And you have to specify some set of distributions that you want to optimize over. And this is very elegant mathematically, and it can work. But of course, it depends on how you specify this set of things that you want to be robust with respect to. So computationally, sometimes the minimax problems are also harder, but there's also sort of a definitional thing. So one strategy that's been quite popular in the literature is to essentially imagine that the distribution actually has subpopulations, like maybe it's stratified by gender, or maybe it's stratified by the hospital where you collected the data or the location. And there might be many such subgroups. And you can think of these as irrelevant factors of variation. So we'll call them Z or Z. We'll call them Z. Now we're here in Vancouver. And the thing that we care about, which might be the health status, we'll call that Y. That's the target label. And you can specify the groups as like a cross product of these two terms. And you want to consider the worst case combination of these. And you can train models that do this. But we all know that minimax is very pessimistic. And it will give you robustness, but it can leave a lot of optimality on the table. So one of the projects that I've been doing recently says, well, why don't we try to actually, instead of being robust, let's be adaptive. So in many settings, you get data from your target distribution, and you don't know the labels, the outcome, of course, because that's the point. You're trying to predict them. But you get like a batch of data coming in, and you can just adapt the model on the fly to the new data distribution. And you want to do that in an unsupervised way. And the question is how. So what we did in this work is we said, okay, let's imagine that the true data generating process has this form, right? So the sum, this is the variable we care about, y, that we want to predict what disease status you have. This is your gender or your sex, which is an extraneous factor that can vary. And they're correlated by some hidden common cause, right? The population from which the data was drawn, for example. And this can vary. That's what the lightning bolt means. So this is an unstable part of the model. But we're going to make this assumption, and it's a strong assumption, but we'll make the assumption that the rest of the data generating process is stable. So this is sort of basically, you can think of this as a causal assumption. The causality is all about what things change and what things are stable as people intervene. And here, there's no explicit intervention. It's just that there's some mechanism changing the data behind our backs. So specifically, we imagine there's some process that generates images as a function of the disease and the gender and maybe other factors that I'm not explicitly representing. So we can write down the source distribution is obtained by just marginalizing out these unknown variables, and that induces a distribution over the source data and similarly over the target data. So the basic idea in our work is to say, okay, we can fit this model. We're going to assume, and again, it's another strong assumption, we assume we have access to these labels in the training, in the source distribution. So we're going to fit this model on the source. And then at runtime and the target distribution, we're just going to observe samples from X. And then we're just going to use EM, one of my favorite algorithms, to infer these latent variables. And we're going to just adapt the prior on these latent factors to adapt to the new distribution. And then we're assuming that this likelihood term, this generative term, is constant. So that's sort of the basic idea of this work. And the reason it's going to work is that we're not changing a lot of parameters. We don't need a lot of data to do this. So let's see, I can't remember how much detail I'll go into. Yeah, so you can think about it like this. So normally you would evaluate performance by looking at your expected loss on the target distribution using a predictive model whose parameters data are derived from the source data, right? And what we do is we say, okay, we're going to take the parameters that are derived from the source data, and then we're going to augment them with extra data that we get from the target distribution, but it's unlabeled. That's the superscript X. And we have some modification procedure, and we use EM, although in fact, I'll show you in a minute that the problem's complex, so you can use any solver you want. So what we want to do is we want to predict the label. We'll predict the map label, let's say if it's 0, 1 loss. And how do we compute this distribution? So by Bayes' rule, we'll just flip things around. We've got a likelihood and a prior. The key, the invariance assumption says our likelihood is the same across both distributions. And that seems very strong, but now recall that Z is all of the factors that change in the world. So we can just stick more, in principle, we can put more factors of variation into Z and then essentially adjust for them. Of course, in practice, that might be difficult, but conceptually, if we expand the capacity of Z, then this assumption becomes more reasonable. And now the magic trick is that since we're doing classification, we don't actually need to write an actual generative model of images, which can be tricky, although I'll talk about, there are ways to do that. I'll get to that at the end. But in many cases, it's easier just to predict target labels. They're low-dimensional quantities. So we just need the likelihood ratio. And so we can actually take a supervised discriminative model and then essentially rescale it by marginalizing out the source prior and then multiplying in the target prior. And we're going to estimate this target prior using EM, and then we're just going to adjust the weights of the discriminative source model. And I realize this is going by really fast. This is just sort of to tease you. If you're interested, you can read it later. So this is what I had on the previous slide. So we can compute the target distribution from the source distribution by just doing this on the fly adaptation. And then there's some equations on the how we do that, but I'll skip that. So let's just show some results. So here what we're doing, we're taking that X-ray data set I mentioned earlier, and we introduce artificial correlation between the sex and the disease status. So and we're assuming everything's binary. So there's male and female sex, and there's healthy and not healthy disease status. And I think in this case it's emphysema. And it's, doctors rated it. It's like some data set of a few 100,000 labeled images from Stanford, I think, I'm not sure where. And we followed prior work and used their procedure for binarizing the labels. So by essentially slicing the data, we can create different correlation patterns between the sex and the disease status, and that's what's plotted on this horizontal axis. Now, the model's only trained on one population, right? And in this one population, it turns out that most of the females are healthy. And you train the model, and what we want to avoid is the situation in which the model says, oh, okay, I can detect, make a sex detector very reliably, like I showed you. And then, well, if they're female, they're going to be healthy, and that's great, right? And then you're going to miss a lot of diseases when it's launched in the wild. So in a given another population, that prior correlation might be different. So what we have here are 3 different kinds of methods. So what we can do is take the baseline model, which is trained on the source distribution represented by this dotted line. And as we vary that target distribution along this one-dimensional correlation parameter, then obviously its performance gets worse and worse and worse. The performance metric here is AUC, which we use because it's a very imbalanced classification problem. We could also use one of those invariant methods, one of those robust optimization methods. And that, as you might expect, it's like minimax, right? So it's basically giving you a performance that's invariant to the change in the distribution. And that's great. It's better than the baseline, but it leaves money on the table. So our method is this adaptive method in blue, and it's actually fitting on the fly the model, or it's adapting the model to a little bit of unsupervised data from the target, and it can pick up on any changes in the correlation and then eke out, improved performance compared to an invariant baseline. So that seems cool. And we did it on some other data sets. This is a toy data set, but it's sort of philosophically similar to the previous one. And you can introduce artificial correlations between like class labels and colors. This is a sort of benchmark data set in the literature, and we get qualitatively the same kind of behavior. And actually on this data set, we did 2 versions. We have one model that's trained on pixels, and then we have another model that's trained on pre-computed image embeddings that was trained in a self-supervised way on a much larger data set. And actually works better, not surprisingly, because it has more data in it. And for that model, because the embedding is so powerful, we can just use logistic regression. So it's like super fast and simple. I mean, you could run it on your phone, right? Yeah, and you can also, my student, I forgot to mention, this is Qing Yao Sun, who's at Chicago, was the lead experimenter on this, and he has been doing some stuff on decision trees, and he tried this on decision trees as well, or random forests actually, and it works just as well. It's like nothing to do with neural nets, right? It's just an adaptation procedure. Okay, so that was just a little taste of what's happening in prediction mode, right? There's lots of headlines about super accurate models, and then there's other gory headlines about failures, and then there's a small set of people trying to solve the failures by working on robustness and adaptation and so on. So that was a little vignette. Let me move on to decision making. So prediction is like predicting what the future could be, and then you have to decide what are you going to do about it, right? And so this is very important and very interesting. So I think Nancy mentioned decision theory in the intro, so everyone here knows this, I guess. Here I'm taking a Bayesian perspective. So we have, why do we need this notation? Oh, I don't know why we don't really need this notation. You define some estimator, which is some policy mapping inputs to an action A, which is minimizing expected loss. And here it's posterior expected loss because we're being Bayesian. And in some cases, you can solve this analytically, right? So you will know this, depending on the loss function, you can get, if it's L2 loss, you get the posterior mean. If it's L1 loss, you get the map label. And then you can have other more interesting things. You could say, well, if you get the answer right, then there's no loss. If you're uncertain, you can always hedge your bets and say, I refuse to classify, and that's going to cost you this amount, lambda sub r. And then if you are confident but you make an error, I'm going to punish you, lambda sub e. Right, and then depending on your confidence threshold, the optimal action is either to say nothing or to pick the map label. So you can do more interesting things when you have cost-sensitive applications, and that's one reason why it's important to have a probabilistic model and not just a point estimate. But I'm more interested in these kinds of problems where like there's a sequence of decisions to make online, and this is a very generic setup, right? I mean, in some ways, all of AI can be cast as a sequential decision-making problem, where like the world evolves according to some process that we don't get to observe directly. And there's some hidden state, hypothetical state, and we don't know what it is. And what we see is a sequence of observations like images or words that people speak. And then I'm some agent down here, and I'm building a mental model of the world as the data streams in. And at every moment in time, let's suppose it's discrete time, I get to pick an action, right? And I can talk or shut up or sleep, or I can do anything. And now, how do we guide this process? Well, as engineers, we'll specify a reward function which sort of is the task that we want the system to try to optimize. Okay, so that's sort of, that's the general agent framework. That's the foundation of AI and economics and lots of engineering problems like, self-guided cars and planes and everything like that, right? But this is a very, very difficult problem. So I'm going to simplify things a bit, just to dive more down into the weeds and focus on something that I've worked on. So let's consider the special case where the environment state is actually fully observed. So the difference between the hidden states S and the observed states X disappears. And now we get to observe the world directly. And let's further assume that the world just randomly changes state every moment in time. And I don't actually affect the world. I'm just a passive perceiver. And I can take actions and get rewards or not in response, but I'm not going to change the state of the world. The world's just evolving on its own. So the only difference between these is like I've cut these edges here and I have full visibility. It's not partially observed anymore. So this is called a multi-arm bandit problem. It's a very classic thing. I guess here I'm highlighting the changes in red, so that the state distribution is now unconditional. So the world just presents a state and I have to react, okay? And this B thing downstairs, I didn't really explain it, but this is my belief state. So it's a probability distribution I have over states of the world, is my model of what I think the world is doing. And I'm going to use that to make decisions. And in the multi-arm bandit setting, we assume that the number of actions is some finite set. So here's some concrete examples, right? So clinical trials, right? A patient shows up in my hospital, and they are characterized by feature vectors, which is the state of the world, and I have to decide what drug to give them. And I've got a finite cocktail of drugs, and then I give them a drug, and then I get the reward, which is like, did they survive for how long did they survive, whatever, right? Some reward I'm trying to optimize. This model family is extremely widely used in industry, right, for recommender systems, so like Netflix and Google Search and Amazon and all of this, right? And there the setup is that some person comes to a website and that person's characterized by their browsing history and the site that they're on. And then you have to recommend something to them, like an ad or a product or a book or a movie, whatever. And then you get some reward. It's like, did they buy it or not? So click-through rate, or like, did they give it high stars? So it's the same mathematical model, but the data set differs. And the goal in all of these problems is to maximize expected reward, right? So you have a sequence of interactions over time, and you're going to get a reward stream coming in, and that's sampled according to random states of the world, the action that you take in response to the world, and then the reward that you get in as a function of the state and the action. Okay. Oh, here's another slide I found online that visualizes things to make it a little bit more concrete. So you could imagine if you're some website provider and you want to know what to show, what ad say to show someone, then depending on the context, right, is this person on their phone, or are they on a desktop machine, or are they at work or at home? Then the same set of web pages, then you've got maybe a different set of actions you could show which correspond to the ads, and then the reward that you get will differ, right? So if I'm looking for shoes at work, maybe I'm looking for different kinds of shoes than if I'm looking for shoes at home, right? Because maybe I'm hiking I want to go hiking when I'm at home, but at work I want proper shoes. I mentioned shoes because my shoelaces broke, so they're kind of anyway, so that's just a little example of where this stuff comes in. And interesting aside, if the number of arms is infinite and the state doesn't evolve, this is basically the same as Bayesian optimization. And so in Bayesian optimization, I see Will's not here today, but in Bayesian optimization, people often use Gaussian processes, and I know Will's done a lot of work in this, and many people have done a lot of work in this. And I'll come back to that point later. But the key issue underlying all of these problems, Bayes-Opt and bandits, and the more general sequential decision problem is this exploration-exploitation problem, right? So I might know that you like a certain kind of movie, and I can keep showing you that, but maybe you like something else more. And I don't know until I show it to you and ask and see if you like it or not. So you have to explore new things because there might be something better around the corner. And you have to trade these things off, because if I keep showing you random things and hoping to find one that you like, then I'm leaving money on the table, like maybe literally, right? Because you could have, like, you definitely like this Disney movie, but maybe you like this more edgy sort of HBO production. So this is a real problem. And obviously there are analogous trade-offs that in the health space as well, right? So the standard solution is this heuristic called upper confidence bound, where you not only predict the expected reward for each possible action, but you have some estimate of uncertainty, and then you try to be optimistic. So you say, well, if I were to do this action, then I expect at most to get this upper bound, right? And then you can pick the action that maximizes your expected upper bounds. And you can prove various things about this being optimal in various senses. The key thing then is that we want to get uncertainty estimates from our model, and we want to update these things online. And we want to do it efficiently, because like we might be putting this inside of a real-time recommended system. So if the model's simple enough, this is all straightforward, right? So you can use like a linear regression model where you have some features S and you just do a linear regression. And if you put Gaussian priors on your parameters, then everything's conjugate. You can do closed form Bayesian updating and life is good. It's very simple. And in fact, in this case, the closed form Bayesian sequential update equations are a special case of the Kalman filtering equations. And so I mentioned this because we're going to build on this in a moment. So we can think of this problem of, so I'm not so much worried about the decision-making problem anymore. I'm going to use, let's say, the UCB heuristic to decide how to act. I'm more focused on the Bayesian inference procedure behind the scenes, which is updating my beliefs as the data streams in, right? So I have some parameters of my model, and in machine learning, they're always W. In statistics, they're always beta, if they're linear models. And they may evolve in time according to a Gaussian random walk, or maybe they're actually static. So there's no noise in this drift process. And then there's some observation model, and maybe it's linear. And if it is linear, I can compute the posterior over the states of the system, which correspond to the parameters, by doing this closed form update, which is what the Kalman filter gives us. And a little shout out to this software library that we built over the summer. Where is Jinglong? Yeah. Yes, so Jinglong and various other students helped me build this. This is cool. If you're interested in state-space modeling, we have this pretty nifty JAX library that lets you handle models like this, not just linear, but non-linear and non-Gaussian and so on. And it's very fast. And it's all differentiable, so you can plug it inside HMC and whatnot. And here's a little eye candy from my book showing that, oh, if you do batch offline Bayesian linear regression and you do online Bayesian linear regression, lo and behold, they converge to the same thing, as theory tells you should be the case. Shrink. Okay, so that's all fine, but these are very limited models, right? Like we were talking at the very beginning that we want to go beyond linearity. So you can use Gaussian processes. People use them for Bayes-Opt, they also use them for bandits, but this is problematic. I mean, they're expensive. The cubic time, and so the cost is increasing at every step. And more importantly, like how do you specify a kernel on a high dimensional space like images or something? It's not so clear. So it's natural to want to use neural nets for this context as well, right? We saw that they work very well earlier on those medical imaging problems. Why don't we use them in the bandit setting? So you can do that. They're called neural bandits. And it's the same setup as before. It's that our reward functions are parameterized by some neural net. But the issue is we want to do Bayesian updating of the parameters. And normally in machine learning, people will do a point estimate and they'll compute that by solving an offline optimization problem by sweeping over the data many, many times. And if you can only afford to see the data once and you're doing it online, then these traditional methods don't work very well. So what you can do, well, a very simple thing you can do is to take the Kalman filter and then apply it to this model family by just linearizing the model at every step. That's called the extended Kalman filter, and this is a classic algorithm that dates back to the 60s. And you can apply it to fit neural nets online. And here's just a little movie to illustrate that. And this is an old idea. There's a NERPS paper from 1989 that was doing this. And this movie is just showing you, this is implemented with our Dynamax library. Here the data is streaming in. The red dots represent each new observation at every time point. And the posterior over what the function looks like is shrinking, and it's fitting the data in the way that you expect. But importantly, at the beginning, it's uncertain. And if we sample from the posterior predicted, it's all over the place and it pretty rapidly shrinks in. And so that's cool. So this is nice. So are we done? Well, the problem is that this algorithm is cubic complexity in the number of parameters. And these models often have millions of parameters. So that's an issue. I just have to show you. You can do it for classification. And then it's not conjugate anymore. in addition to being nonlinear, but you can do tricks. Here's this is something I want to highlight though. So this is a two-class classification problem. If you just do one pass over the data and you do SGD, it doesn't do a very good fitting. In this case, it was like a shallow MLP. But if you do one pass of this EKF, it does great. Now SGD will catch up if you go over the data many times, but that's not always an option for data streaming in. So we like these one-pass algorithms. I like these one-pass algorithms, but they're expensive. So what we want to do in this piece of work, and this is actually something I'm continuing to work on, is to try to speed things up. Now, why are the... Okay, I must remind myself to check that what you see. So here this is just a cute trick that seems to work well in some cases at least. So we leverage the fact that these neural nets, even though they might have millions of parameters, the number of effective degrees of freedom is actually quite small. It might just be in the hundreds. So here's a visualization of that fact, where if we take a model trained on the endless classification data set, and what you can do is you can pick up a point estimate, which might be like a million-dimensional anchor, and that could even be a random vector. And now you can just optimize the remaining parameters in a low-dimensional subspace and try to find some point in this manifold which will capture the remaining error. So you pick an origin basically, and then you pick a point in the subspace that performs well. And as you increase the dimensionality of the subspace, you're going to fill the full original parameter space, and obviously you'll recover the original performance. But this plot shows you that you can get, as a function of the subspace dimensionality, you can get very close to the original performance using just a few hundred dimensions. And that's because these models are massively over-parameterized, and the parameters are not independent. So what we said is, okay, let's identify the subspace, and you can either pick a random subspace, or you can use like SVD applied to like an SGD trajectory, and then let's just do Bayesian inference in the subspace. So we use the same EKF machinery I just showed you, but we apply it in the subspace. And you can do that online. And I'll skip the pseudocode, it's very simple really. And then we applied it on some standard data sets, and we win. And there you go. This is actually a synthetic recommender system. I'm going to skip the details, but basically this sort of EKF in the subspace is outperforming various other, actually much more complicated online neural bandit methods. And interestingly, just like Bayesian linear regression works quite well. So some of these data sets are very simple, and you get really quite far with the linear model. But obviously that's data set specific. And we're currently extending this. So here we had to pick the subspace up front. So there's a sort of a warm-up cost, and that's really kind of unsatisfying. And if the data is changing, that's not really going to fly. So we are currently extending this to try to do online low-rank approximations. Okay. All right, so that's prediction and decision making, and there's lots more work in the decision making space with reinforcement learning, but it's not something I've worked on very much myself. I have a few papers, but I'm going to skip it. Let me talk about something completely different. One of the original goals of machine learning was not just predict the future, but actually try to make sense of data. And this is maybe has more overlap with statistics actually, where you're really collaborating with a domain expert who's trying to understand the data, and they're trying to do scientific discovery. And ultimately, maybe they'll use their discoveries to make actions and do things in the real world. But first, they want to get insight. So you can get pretty far with pretty simple models. Here's a little Gaussian mixture model applied to some points in 2D, and lo and behold, it discovers 3 clusters. And why 3? Well, then you can write lots of papers about model selection and all that. You can do linear PCA, right? So this is a figure from apparently it's a very famous paper where they applied PCA to some SNP data, and they sort of rediscovered that you get nice separation in this 2D space that coincides with the geography of where people are from. And this is just a simple linear unsupervised model, right? So, but it's useful. But linear models have their limitations. So it's natural to want to have a nonlinear version of PCA. So you can do that. So here, Z is our latent space, and our decoder, which is mapping from latent space to visible, can be a neural net instead of a linear function. So that's nonlinear PCA. And now we have to fit that thing, and that's difficult because you know that you can fit PCA with EM, but the E step is complicated. So we can approximate the posterior by training another neural network. And that's what variational autoencoders are all about. Who actually has heard of VAEs in this audience? Okay, we're almost over. Okay, that's great. So, and you could do new cool things, right, with this embedding space. So you can take all kinds of data, like molecule data represented in the SMILES format, which is like a string representation, and then learn embeddings. And once you have these embeddings, you can use them as subroutines for things like Bayesian and do, data efficient molecule design and nifty things. And oh, okay, this didn't. Okay, so you can do that, and that's fun. Another sort of data set type that comes up a lot is time series data. So here, spoiled my slide, but never mind. Imagine that what you get is like you get some input like this, and there's this dot moving around. Maybe it's an animal in a cage or a cell under a microscope or whatever, and you're trying to understand its behavior. And maybe you want to use that understanding for prediction, but your primary goal is understanding. So if you watch this long enough, you can sort of see that it's tracing some trajectory, and it looks like this. I've sort of revealed the truth there, as it were. It actually is coming from this data generating process where it's a linear model. It's sort of on this, like think of a race car on a track, right? It zooms along here at some speed, and then it switches into this sort of nonlinear behavior. Maybe there's another linear piece, and then another different kind of nonlinear behavior, and these are all stitched together. And what we'd like to do is like discover something like this on the right from something like this on the left. And I think you can imagine why this is useful. So we had a paper on this, which basically is using this model on the left, which is like a mashup of a hidden Markov model, which has discrete states which specify which regime you're in, and then a variational autoencoder that has continuous states that are specifying like the location of that particle or the behavioral mode, the subspace that you're in. And so, this hybrid model has got a switching nonlinear dynamical system, and many variants of this have been explored over the years by many people. But nevertheless, even still in 2020, and I would say I think still in 2022, we don't have like reliable ways of fitting these models. But we had a trick in this paper. So the key idea is that we already know how to fit these variational autoencoders pretty reliably by training neural networks to estimate the posterior, right? And we can maximize some bound on the marginal likelihood to do that. And that relies on the fact that these are continuous random variables, and we can use this thing called the reparameterization trick. And when you add discrete variables, you lose all of that beauty, and you have to do more expensive estimators. So the key observation was that, well, if we had an inference network that told us what these Z variables were, then we could sample from that, and then they would be observed. And once they're observed, then what we're left over with is an HMM, and we can marginalize that analytically using the forwards-backwards algorithm. So we can collapse them out. So these things now go by using forwards-backwards as a subroutine, and then we're left with a continuous latent variable model. It's nonlinear, but it's continuous, and then now we can train an inference network to predict these hidden states. And in this case, we use the bidirectional RNN to do that. So that's sort of the key idea. There's a lot of sauce to make this work. It's secret sauce. It's not an easy thing to optimize, but because of mode collapse and things like that. But if you stir the pot enough, you can get some cool results out. I mean, these are admittedly very simple data sets, but this is the thing I showed you earlier. This is called the Dobbins path, by the way. You can look it up on Wikipedia. And what's so you see this thing moving around. It's actually coming from a model of this form. You can fit it with like a switching piecewise linear model, and this has been well studied, like in the econometrics literature. They've been using this for a long time. And the problem with that is that it's going to over-segment, right? Because it's trying to approximate this nonlinear thing as a set of linear models. So it will partition it too much. And is this bad? Well, I mean, this is unsupervised learning. What is good, right? There is no metric here, right? It just feels unparsimonious. So it seems preferable that a simpler model that allows a little bit of nonlinearity is what sort of the user really has in mind. But it is a fundamental problem, right? When your models become expressive enough, like if my neural network here can model everything, and I don't need to use any of these discrete states, and I can still fit the data. That's not really what I want. So it's a tricky thing when you're doing unsupervised structured discovery, because we don't really know what we're looking for. And it's hard to tell what the right answer is unless you're a domain expert. In this case, we cook the data up so we know the answer. But you can apply it to other. So here's another example of that. So here's a data set. This is motion capture data. So it's like, I guess it's 20 or 30 markers on a body and their X, Y, Z coordinates over time. So it's, a few hundred dimensional. And you get this streaming in and you want to make sense of it, right? And so this comes up a lot in biology and whatnot. You want to track animals and figure out if the behavior changing, maybe in response to various stimuli. And so what we do is we fit our model to it, and it discovers there are 3 regimes. And in the first regime, it's basically sort of linear motion as this person. So this is some kind of swing dancing, right? So there's some sort of linear motion, and then they pivot in one direction or they pivot in the other. And so you can sort of go in, and when the model assigns a certain state, you can visualize the data and try to interpret what's going on. But is this a good model? I don't know. I mean, it looks cute, but this is sort of a fundamental problem with the whole discovery enterprise. But clearly, this is of great utility in many areas. I would say to the most. I think to be really useful, we need to be able to fit much more complicated models than the ones I was describing. And like shout out to Frank Wood, who's in the audience, who's been doing a lot of work on fitting simulation models to scientific data, where the scientist creates the model, right? And it might be likelihood free inference, and the inference problem becomes very complicated. But you can use neural nets as subroutines to help, as proposal distributions for MCMC or in some other way. So I think this is a very interesting area. I'm not personally working on it myself currently anyway, but I think this is very cool. But it does have these issues that you can't really work on this topic unless you have a domain expert who's like going to validate your outputs. But this is huge. Like Microsoft has a whole, I think I skipped a slide, but Chris Bishop, who some of you may know, who's the head of ML for science at Microsoft, he calls it like the 5th wave science, whatever. And it's like, okay, ML is going to revolutionize all kinds of areas, and it's already having huge impact, right, in biology and material design and so on. So that's the 3rd pillar. All right, the 4th pillar, generation. So this is probably the funnest. And this is, making a big splash. It's all over the news these days, right? Like here's a McKinsey report from like a couple of weeks ago, and the phrase generative AI is often used. And they're saying, okay, what is generative AI? It's basically a system that can generate effectively high-dimensional couplets, right? So mathematically, generative AI is just P of X, where X is some high-dimensional thing, like a sequence of words or a sequence of images, and C is some input that the user provides, like a prompt or a spoken word or whatever, right? Or just random noise. So that's what generative AI is in one symbol. But that sort of, that leaves the $1 million question on the table, which is what is the form of that model? And of course, other questions like where does the data come up from and so on. So there are many forms that you can use for that model, and I don't have time to go into them. You can read my book to learn about these things. I have 6 chapters on this topic, one for each member of the zoo here. But I just thought instead of talking about all these different models, I'll just show some eye candy of what they can do, because I think it's more fun. And then I'll do a little tease at the end about one thing we've been doing internally. So you've heard about ChatGPT, and you can do it for all kinds of fun things. And one of my colleagues, Paige Bailey, asked ChatGPT to write a rap battle between PyTorch and JAX. So for the people who are actually coding in these languages, they can read this offline. It's pretty funny. It's actually shockingly good. It's just, yeah, anyway. I'll make that slide available later. You could do other, even more fun things that maybe everyone can understand, even if you're not coding. So these prompts were created by Irina Block, who's at Google, who's one of our sort of main graphic designers. So you can say to the system, okay, make me an image of toilet paper with real cactus spikes, and it spits this out, which is kind of shocking, or a coffee cup with holes, or a cute corgi living in a house made of sushi. And it's just amazing. Like, it's mind-blowingly good and just so much fun. So there are a few caveats. So this, I forgot to explain this image at the beginning. I said I'm using the 4-pillar metaphor, right? But I also had this image. So this image is generated by one of these systems that we have internally. This is a hybrid of the Imogen fusion system and the Party autoregressive system. And so this was, it's not available for external. It's available via the AI test kitchen, but Google's been a little slower in releasing these things compared to other companies for various reasons. Although you can get great results, it's not exactly reliable technology. So it can generate things that you don't want it to generate, that are offensive or just wrong. And if you and to get it to do what you want, sometimes you have to like tune the prompts. So Irina calls herself the prompt whisperer, and I asked her because I tried to make some imagery for this talk using this system. Actually, I tried several systems, and I could not get anything sensible out of it. And then she came up with this prompt. Where did you come up with that prompt? Like, who is this Tom Scott? Turns out to be a Scottish artist. And she tried a few things, but like she has the magic touch apparently. I don't know how many iterations it took her to create this, but so it's definitely alchemy. But people are improving this. So just one little vignette. Like there's many. This is a hugely fast-moving field, obviously. Just wanted to give a shout out to one recent piece of work we have. So this is a system, Muse, which the basic idea is to quantize the image patches into tokens and now treat it like a language modeling problem. So you don't have to do that. You can work in pixel space or in a continuous space, but this has some engineering advantages. So once you've learned your codebook, your vector quantized codebook using some GAN loss function, now you've essentially got a sequence prediction problem, just like these other language problems. But they're kind of slow, especially when you apply them to the image domain. So the key trick in this paper is to recognize that you can actually generate in parallel by decoding multiple locations in the image grid. So you're going to basically, I have time to explain this. So at each step, you're going to sample the value for one of these discrete tokens that is currently unobserved. And you can predict them all in parallel, and you can pick like the top K most confident ones. And then you can sample from them or just clamp them to their map value. And then they become known. And now you go on to the next step. And it turns out if you do this process, because you're predicting not just one at a time, but like, a dozen at a time, you only need about 5 or 6 steps to go all the way to produce the full image. So it's much faster than some of these other models. And it has other advantages because it's been trained to work with like partially filled in images. It can sort of impute anything from anything. So you can do things like this. So you can mask out a region, and then you can ask it to fill in that hole, and then what do you want to fill it in with? Well, you just say in the text, a funny big inflatable yellow duck, or hot air balloons, or a futuristic streamlined modernity building. And it's never seen these kinds of things before, but it's learned how to fill in holes because it's been trained to fill in holes with plausible hallucinations based on the statistics of the world, right? And this is paired with text data. So the hallucinations are conditional on the text prompt that you provide. And then you can do outpainting. So you've got some little image and you want to make a big image. And this is useful, actually, like they use stuff like this in the advertising teams where they want to, some company has a logo and they want to make it bigger to fit on it's designed for a mobile phone and they want it to look good on your web browser on the desktop. So like there are real applications of this. And you can also do other sort of really cool things. You can just say in words, I want to modify this image. So you say, okay, I don't want a man wearing a t-shirt. Instead, I want a man wearing a blue t-shirt with the Hello World logo written on it, or wearing a Christmas sweater, or a woman wearing a dress. And you just say what you want, and sometimes it doesn't. More often than not, actually, it's kind of cool. And this is using this classifier pre-guidance approach where the prompt, so we subtract out the negative prompt, and then we add in the positive prompt and guide it in the direction that we want. Okay, here's how does it compare to some of the other systems? So these are 2 Google systems. The Muse is the one I just described that quantizes and does this parallel decoding mechanism, which you can actually think of as discrete diffusion in latent space. You can also do continuous diffusion in latent space. That's the stable diffusion thing that I'm sure many of you have heard of. You can do continuous diffusion in pixel space. That's DALI 2, or you can, and then Google has a version of that as well. They differ in the details of the data sets and the models and so on, but at the high level, they're all quite similar. So that's the 4th pillar, it's the generation. So that's like super hot right now, and it's a very fun space to work on. Now, just to wrap up, I didn't talk about the foundations under these pillars, right? So this is only 4 parts of my book. I actually have 6 parts of my book. So what are the other 2 parts? Well, I talk about like what actual foundations, like cross-cutting themes, like optimization, inference, basics of probability and statistics and linear algebra and all that stuff. And then there are other things I don't talk about, like systems issues, hardware, specialized hardware that makes all these large models efficient, probabilistic programming languages, order differentiation packages. I mean, a lot of the innovation is because of improvements to the hardware and improvements to the software tooling, right? A lot of these methods, like I introduced at the very beginning, remember, it's like MLE versus SGD, right? Like we've been knowing that since the 50s. So why does it work now when it didn't work then? Well, we have GPUs and we have good code bases. So, and a lot of data. And on the data side, there's a lot of issues around privacy and ethics and how do you collect it, human-computer interaction and things like that. So there are, lots of other topics that I didn't talk about today because they're not so central to these sort of 4 application areas. But hopefully that gave you a flavor of what's going on in the ML field and a little taste of some of the things I'm doing. And I'll turn it over to questions.
I see a hand over there. We also have questions online, so we'll see how it goes.
Yeah. Live question.
Right. I think it's practice. Yeah.
He's trying to heckle me.
So I noticed that you didn't use your EKF subspace training method in any of the latter part of your talk.
Correct.
Should we believe that the EKF subspace approach has any relevance to modern methods? Or models, I should say, and a very specific point about the EKF, obviously, you can turn to practice many other online learning methods, but there seemed to be one that I didn't quite follow, which is that you're assuming that the parameter space is varying over time in that.
Well, actually, we actually assume 0 noise, but it's so so you can allow it to drift, and that probably gets you some robustness. But
I was actually confused by the graphical models that you were showing, which appeared to.
There is some
error. Direct on the right hand side, but I don't.
So here, so what Frank's asking about is this equation, which I didn't really explain carefully, but this is a dynamical process on the weights, right?
Yep.
And if you have 0 noise in this Gaussian, then in fact it's a constant function, and you're just doing sequential Bayesian updating, and that's why it converges to the patch solution. Right.
But that was my first worry. But then the question is, do you really actually? I mean, this is.
Does it scale to million parameter models?
Indeed.
We tried it on a million parameter, like we did a
CNN.
No, it doesn't.
No.
So in this piece of work, the trick was we used a random. Well, we learned the subspace, but you could use a random subspace. I don't know if this dimensionality reduction trick applies to what you call modern models. Like, so it works on CNNs and MLPs, but I've never tried it on transformers or diffusion models and things like that. And I don't know, like here we're using a few hundred dimensions, but if we need thousands of dimensions, we still can't afford cubic complexity, right? Because we're doing matrix inversion in that low dimensional space. So low dimension has to be like hundreds. If we're in the thousands, we're already screwed with the current method. But we're working on new things for online low rank and low rank plus diagonal, and you can choose the rank, right? And you can just say, right, I can only afford rank 10, right? And then you can have a diagonal term. And I didn't say this, but
something relatively profound about model
testing. Yes, exactly. So that was an important point Frank made. So actually, this phenomenon that you can compress these models to low dimensions, it's not due to me. Like this is recognized by several people, but particularly these 2 papers. So this is Roseanne Liu and colleagues, Jason Yasinski, I don't know the other authors, and they showed that with certain model families like multi-layer perceptrons and CNNs, you can compress, and certain data sets, you can compress them very aggressively. But that just shows you that these are really simple problems and simple models, right? So, and we leverage that fact. But so I'm not claiming that our online inference is a generic solution. I mean, it would be great if it were, in these there are certain niches like recommender systems where people are still using relatively small models. Like embeddings might be large, and certainly in robotics and things like that, right? Where the data is streaming in and it's changing, and you want to adapt, right? Scaling this to larger domains is an open issue, but you could imagine some hybrid of like a point, some things are point estimated, and you maintain uncertainty about the things that matter. And that might change over time, right? So you can hybridize all of this with, sequential Monte Carlo and so on, and then you can choose which parts are constant, which are uncertain. So there's lots of games you can play, but which ones matter, I don't know.
Okay, so we have a couple of questions from the audience. First one from, it seems more like a comment from Olivier Cote. It says, if you ever let go Gaussian processes, I suggest using a coherent risk measure such as T-bar, C-bar, or E-bar to calculate UCB. I don't know.
Conditional value of risk and so on.
Yeah.
Sure. I'm not an expert on bandits. Where was that? That was this slide here, right? This is just a cover story to justify why I'm being Bayesian. So I'll take any decision procedure that someone's come up with, UCB, or actually we did use UCB, but we also use Thompson sampling a lot because it's simpler and also has nice theoretical properties. And we can swap in whatever he's recommended. Sure. But the point is all of those algorithms are driven by some uncertainty measure. And like there's a lot of work on Bayesian neural nets, but there's very little work on online learning and online Bayesian learning. And that was sort of, this is one reason why you want to. Right? If you're just doing a static prediction problem, you probably don't need all this Bayesian machine learning.
Okay. Second question from Marianne. The question is, how weak supervision and generating synthetic data could be coupled meaningfully in the context of medical image labeling?
Oh yeah, people are doing that, right? So I portrayed these as.
Couldn't hear the question.
Yeah, the question was how could let's say how could you use generative models to create training data for service models?
And in general, coupled meaningfully in the context of medical learning.
I don't know about meaningfully,
Yeah.
but I mean, you can train, right? So I presented these kinds of images, right? So, and you saw the thing at the end where we were generating pictures of dogs eating sushi or whatever, right? So clearly you can train a generative model on X-ray images and you can hallucinate as much data as you want. You don't necessarily know what the labels are in terms of the disease, right? So, and then the features are quite subtle. So people are working on this where they try to use generative models to augment the training sets for more prediction-based models, discriminative models. But it's tricky, right? Because they might, like the visual features are very hard for us to distinguish. So I'm flipping around a lot. I'm trying to show that image again. It's not clear, we don't have enough of this kind of data, right? So if you pre-train on the web and you fine-tune it on X-ray data, and then you start hallucinating more data and you feed it into a model and then you give it to a patient, I'm not sure I want to be that patient, right? So it's tricky, but people are trying, honestly, because data acquisition is difficult. There was a live question. Yes.
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you for this very nice talk. Luckily enough, I actually had a question about this particular example. So I think this is kind of a dumb question. Why does the performance of your method start to sort of decay at the beginning, but then improve as you change the domain even farther away from the original?
So in the middle of the curve, the reason it dips is that they're not correlated anymore. So there's no headroom for us of our method over the baseline. And then the key trick is that we're estimating the prior correlation between Y and Z on the target distribution. And so if there is correlation, we'll pick it up and then we can leverage it in base rule basically because our base rate has changed. So in the edges where there's correlation, we find it and then we exploit it. And the other methods are trying to be invariant to that. And then if there is no correlation, everyone does the same. So yeah.
I had a slightly, I guess, higher level question about the switching linear dynamical system type work. So something that's always bothered me about that line of work, not yours, but just in general, is kind of what you mentioned, which is how do you, I guess, force or move the model to assign certain behavior to the, I guess, latent high level bit,
Yeah,
and certain behavior to the like big neural network sponge that can kind of
Yeah.
soak up whatever.
yeah.
And
So
so I mean, in sort of two ways. One, in sort of a theoretical or foundational way, how do you make that distinction? But second, even in just practice, like what do you do? Do you just try it many times and get different answers?
So we had to do annealing, which people often do in clustering models, right?
Yeah.
So I actually forget the details and I don't have them in the slides, but essentially there were like various KL penalties that restrict effectively the capacity of. I'm trying to remember what we were doing. There were synthetic hacks, unfortunately.
Because annealing implies that there is sort of a correct answer, and you usually need like a better method to go find and explore to get to that answer.
Yeah. So I do think it's partly an optimization problem. So one thing we did is we had an entropy penalty where we encouraged it to use old states rather than just explaining everything with one mode.
Okay, so you've included penalties to basically say, like,
Yes.
try to use this latent structure as
Yes.
much as possible.
Yes, and we have to do that. And if you don't, it will just ignore it. It just has one mode, and the neural net is happy explaining everything.
That does it.
Yeah.
Okay.
So with the entropy penalty, like we'll spread things out, and then what will happen is like the data, just due to random symmetry breaking of the initialization, the different states will end up specializing in different parts of the model, and then you break symmetry in it, and then it starts working. But yeah, there's also like how many states and so on, and you could do fancy non-parametric.
Is there any like rigorous, I guess, way to design this penalty that sort of forces the distinction between these two parts of the model, or is it just sort of a hack right now?
I don't know of anything rigorous. I mean, I'd like to, but yeah. That's why I say this is quite delicate to get working. It is frustrating because it seems so simple. Yeah.
I have a question from old school.
About what?
From the old school.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm thinking of the Bayesian analysis when in my limited reading of the Bayesian work in machine learning and etc. It seems that when the prior distributions like they are quite actually do not really give you any prior information. On top of that, in the middle of the data analysis, then you will have variation of inference, which really means that throw away the original one, pick something that is close and keep going. I'm trying to see if it is very successful. Is it because your data set is so large, it really doesn't matter which prior distribution you select in the beginning, and as long as it enables you to carry out the algorithm smoothly? Is that a fair?
I think in the
assessment?
really big data regime, I mean, Frank was kind of asking this. People are not using Bayesian methods because it's difficult computation, but B, they don't really need to because you can push to a point estimate. So it's actually the small data regime where Bayes is useful. And in that setting, I think the reason it seems to work is that these model families are fairly flexible, and as long as you allow the parameters to wiggle, even from like a Gaussian prior, then they're actually going to cover a reasonable set of plausible hallucinations. You have to like tune the variances a little bit, but I'll show you. I can show you that actually here, for example. Just watch at the beginning of this video. These are samples from So see all those light lines. So I've seen what a half a dozen data points. The red is the current data point, and so blue is my posterior mean. So it's like kind of going through all the data as you'd expect, but it's really uncertain. And I'm going to draw posterior predictives, and that's what the light samples are, and they're all over the map. And that's just from a Gaussian prior, but a Gaussian prior on a neural network can create all kinds of things, right? You don't need a lot of data, and it starts collapsing down to plausible things. And now after 20 data points, it's basically
So
now
the trial will be washed out when the data comes in.
Yeah,
Right?
yeah,
And
exactly.
it really doesn't matter what trial you select, as long as it makes the.
As long as it has
algorithm
support
work.
on the actual data that you see, yeah. Now, if the world's changing, then the priors will matter more. And prior selection for neural nets is very difficult, and it's quite unsatisfying because nobody knows what these parameters mean, and it's not, it's sort of a placeholder. You could do everything in the function space, and people have got work where you'll write down a GP prior that you might believe, and then you can like distill it into a neural network. Yeah, I mean that's fine, but you have to pick your kernel, right? So there's no free lunch.
Okay, there are some off-topic questions that I want, I guess I'll leave it to the end if we have time. A bit more on topic would be a question by Terence Saditsky. He asked if there's any role for scalable MCMC, I guess in your work.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, this is a Gaussian filter that I'm showing here, right? So this is a unimodal posterior approximation, which is terrible. Like we know there's multimodal uncertainty, and in principle, MCMC can cover those modes, and in the batch setting, SG MCMC can work quite well, and people do use that. In fact, we use that in the work we're doing right now. We use HMC as some stochastic gradient variant of that as our Oracle ground truth Bayesian estimator. But it's not so easy to make that work online. I mean, you can do SMC, and you can hybridize these. So all of these are valid. But here we're targeting, this is a fully deterministic method, and it's very fast. And that was sort of point in the design space.
Another question, I guess, more philosophical in some sense, from Oliver Gunther. He asks, can we make better causal statements? And the question goes, if you were in a talk show with Judy Apero, how would you try to convince him that ML is not glorified curve fitting?
Tell him to watch this talk. Well, humans learn causal models of the world by observing, but also interacting, right? So I think if you allow your agents to interact with the world and test the consequences of their predictions, and you get some feedback, then you can use that to learn causal models, because that's what people do. So, I mean, if you allow ML to be, if you think of ML as just 1D curve fitting, then that's mischaracterizing it, right? If it's just passively observing all the internet, you can do pretty well. Like this, he's on Twitter, right? I don't know who follows him on Twitter, but there's I want to say a flame war. There's a healthy debate with Yuta about whether these large language models are learning causality. And you can ask them questions that sort of probe that, and it actually works surprisingly well, given that it's just trained on a passive data stream. But now you can imagine, like but ChatGPT is actually not just trained on a passive data stream. They also have feedback from humans, right? Using reinforcement learning. But it's still not taking its, in a sense, it's taking actions because it's spitting out text and saying, hey, what do you think? So it is acting in a way. And then the human says, oh, that's terrible. And then it won't do that anymore, right? So it's already acting and not just like absorbing the static internet. And you could imagine if it was hooked up to a robot, then it would, it could test physical theories. And so, yeah, I mean, the causal models, like this stuff on distribution shifts, I mean, causal models are just making assumptions about what things are invariant and what things are not. And most of the assumptions are untestable, right? And there's obviously a huge work on identifiability. But the fact that humans can learn it means that machines can learn it too, right? But maybe not the current architectures.
Another question says, I have a question on the HMM part. I noticed that in the graphical representation in the slides, it seems that you are using HMM with some feedback dependence. Can you comment more the inference or the design of the model structure in this context?
Oh, that's getting down into the weeds. Well, someone's paying attention. So I think this question is referring to this. This is somebody who knows this area, obviously. This little dotted arc that looks so innocent. So this is the switching variable. These discrete switching variables are not just dependent on the previous hidden states, as in the vanilla HMM, but also depend on this hidden continuous state. And that would apparently preclude the use of forwards backwards. Okay, so the trick I didn't explain, but we have an inference. I wasn't sure how much time I had. So we have an inference network, which is this deterministic bidirectional RNN, and we draw a posterior sample from that. So Z, 1 to T. And now that's observed, and we can condition on it. And once it's conditioned, it's just like data. And then we can use forwards backwards. So that's the trick.
Yeah, it's 12:30 now, so yeah, I think we can wrap it up here. There are no more questions. So thanks again to our fabulous speaker. Thank you guys for being here. And yeah, looking forward to activities in the rest of the day.
Great, thank you.